A landlord stood outside a bedroom door, listening to a 6-year-old child pray. Minutes later, that child would be stabbed 26 times. The weapon, a 7-inch military-style serrated knife. The motive, the boy was Palestinian. The killer, a man who had lived peacefully beside this family for years, who had shared meals with them, who had called them friends. What transforms a neighbor into a murderer? What poison seeps so deeply into the human mind that it turns a child into an enemy? Before we begin, make sure you subscribe so you never miss stories like this. On October 14, 2023, in a quiet suburb of Plainfield, Illinois, something unspeakable happened inside a modest rental home. Wadea al-Fayoume, a first grader with bright eyes and an infectious smile, was murdered in an act so brutal, so calculated, and so ideologically driven that it would force America to confront an uncomfortable truth. Hatred doesn't always announce itself with torches and rallies. Sometimes it lives next door, sometimes it smiles at you. Sometimes it waits. The al-Fayoume family had moved to the United States seeking safety, seeking the promise that America offered to so many. A place where your children could grow up without fear, where your identity wouldn't mark you for violence, where you could simply exist. Hanaan, Wadea's mother, was a Palestinian-American woman who had worked hard to build a stable life for her son. She was a devoted mother, deeply connected to her faith and her heritage, but also fully integrated into American life. She spoke English fluently, worked a regular job, and raised her son with the same hopes and dreams as any other parent in suburban Illinois. Their landlord was Joseph Chuba, a 71-year-old man who had owned the property for years. By all outward appearances, he seemed unremarkable. He was retired, lived on the same property in a separate unit, and had maintained what appeared to be a cordial, even friendly relationship with his tenants. Hanaan had known him for years. There had been dinners together, conversations, the kind of casual neighborly interactions that build trust over time. Wadea had played in the yard while Joseph watched. There had been no obvious warning signs, no overt hostility, no red flags that would have suggested what was coming. But something was changing inside Joseph Chuba's mind. Something dark and consuming. In the weeks leading up to October 14th, the world was watching the escalation of violence in the Middle East. The conflict between Israel and Hamas had erupted into open warfare, and the images flooding news channels and social media were horrific. Civilians dying, children caught in crossfire. Ancient hatreds reignited. And in living rooms across America, people were choosing sides, often with a fervor that bordered on religious conviction. The discourse became toxic, polarized, dehumanizing. Palestinians were terrorists. Israelis were oppressors. Nuance evaporated. Empathy collapsed. And for some people, the violence happening thousands of miles away became personal. Joseph Chuba was one of those people. He began consuming media obsessively. News reports, social media posts, commentary that painted Palestinians not as a diverse population of millions, but as a monolithic threat. The propaganda was effective because it was everywhere, and it fed into something primal: fear. Fear of the other. Fear of Islam. Fear of people who looked different, prayed differently, spoke differently. And fear, when left unchecked, when nurtured by ideology and isolation, transforms into hatred. And hatred, when it finds a target, becomes violence. Would you have noticed the change in someone you knew? Would you have seen the signs? Hanaan didn't, or perhaps she did, but couldn't imagine the depth of what was brewing. In the days before the murder, Joseph had knocked on her door. He was agitated, she would later recall. He wanted to talk about the war. He was angry. He made comments about Muslims, about Palestinians. The conversation was uncomfortable, but Hanaan tried to de-escalate. She was used to this in a way. Many Muslim Americans, many Arab Americans had learned to navigate these moments, to absorb the hostility, to explain, to humanize themselves over and over again. She likely thought it would pass, that he would calm down, that their years of peaceful coexistence would outweigh whatever he was feeling in that moment. She was wrong. On the morning of October 14th, Hanaan was in her bedroom with Wadea. It was a Saturday. The boy was playing, perhaps watching cartoons, perhaps drawing, doing the things 6-year-olds do when they feel safe in their own home. Hanaan heard a noise. The door to their unit, which she thought she had locked, was opening. Before she could react, Joseph Chuba was inside. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He had a knife. What goes through a person's mind in that moment? When someone you know, Someone you trusted, someone who had been part of your daily life, suddenly becomes a threat? The cognitive dissonance must be overwhelming. The brain struggles to process it. This can't be happening. This isn't real. But it was real. And it was happening fast. Joseph attacked Hanaan first. He stabbed her multiple times, the blade tearing into her body with savage force. She fought back, she screamed, she tried to protect her son. But Joseph was larger, stronger, and driven by something beyond reason. He overpowered her, leaving her bleeding and barely conscious on the floor, and then he turned to Wadea. The boy was 6 years old. He weighed less than 50 pounds. He had no way to defend himself. No way to understand why this was happening. No framework in his young mind to comprehend that he was being murdered because of who he was, because of his heritage, because of his faith, because of a conflict happening in a place he had never been. Joseph Chuba stabbed Wadea al-Fayoume 26 times. 26 times. Let that number settle in your mind. This was not a moment of rage that passed. This was not a single violent act. This was sustained, deliberate, relentless brutality inflicted on a child. Each stab was a choice. Each wound was intentional. And when it was over, Joseph left the boy's small body on the floor and walked away. Hanaan, despite her injuries, managed to call 911. Her voice on that call, later released to the public, is almost unbearable to hear. The pain, the terror, the desperate plea for help. She was bleeding out, but her first concern was her son. Paramedics arrived within minutes. They found Hanaan critically wounded but alive. They found Wadea in the bedroom. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Joseph Chuba did not flee. He did not try to hide. He was found sitting outside the property, covered in blood, waiting. When police arrived, he was calm, disturbingly calm. He did not resist arrest. He did not deny what he had done. In fact, according to investigators, he seemed almost relieved, as if he had completed a mission, as if he had done something necessary. Do you think he felt justified? Do you think, in his mind, he was protecting something? The investigation moved quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. Joseph's own statements to police were damning. He admitted to the attack. He admitted that he targeted Hanaan and Wadea because they were Palestinian. Because they were Muslim. He told investigators that he was angry about what was happening in the Middle East, that he believed Muslims were dangerous, that he had to act. The hate crime designation was clear and unambiguous. This was not a random act of violence. This was ideological murder. But here is where the story becomes even more disturbing. Joseph Chuba was not a member of any extremist group. He had no criminal record. He had no history of violence. He was not on any watch list. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary American man who had lived an ordinary life. And yet he became a killer. How does that happen? The answer lies in the insidious nature of radicalization. We often think of radicalization as something that happens to young men in foreign countries, lured into terrorist organizations through propaganda and indoctrination. But radicalization happens here too. It happens quietly. It happens in living rooms and on computer screens. It happens when fear is weaponized, when dehumanization becomes normalized, when people are taught to see entire groups as threats rather than individuals. Joseph Chuba consumed media that told him Palestinians were terrorists, that Muslims were invaders, that violence against them was not just acceptable but necessary. And because he was isolated, because he had no counterbalance, no relationships that humanized the people he was being taught to hate, the ideology took root. It grew. It festered. And eventually, it demanded action. This is the psychology of extremist hatred. It begins with fear. Fear is then amplified by selective information, by echo chambers, by voices that confirm and validate that fear. The fear transforms into anger. The anger seeks a target. And once the target is identified, once the enemy is named, violence becomes logical. It becomes, in the mind of the extremist, a form of self-defense. Joseph Chuba did not see himself as a murderer. He saw himself as a protector. He saw a 6-year-old child and believed that child was a threat. Would you have been able to reach him before it was too late? Could anyone? The community of Plainfield was shattered. Vigils were held. Thousands of people gathered to mourn Wadea, to support Hanaan, to condemn the hatred that had taken root in their midst. The image of Wadea, smiling in his school photo, became a symbol. A reminder of innocence destroyed. A reminder that hate crimes are not abstract statistics. They are children who will never grow up. They are families torn apart. They are communities forced to confront the darkness within. Hanaan survived her injuries, but the trauma of that day will never leave her. She lost her son in the most horrific way imaginable. She was betrayed by someone she trusted. She was targeted for simply existing. And she has had to live with the knowledge that her child's last moments were filled with terror and pain. No mother should have to carry that burden. Joseph Chuba was charged with first-degree murder, attempted murder, and hate crimes. The legal process moved forward, but the questions remained. How do we prevent this from happening again? How do we identify radicalization before it turns deadly? How do we combat the ideologies that teach people to hate? The uncomfortable truth is that Joseph Chuba is not an anomaly. He is a symptom of a larger disease. Across the United States, hate crimes have been rising. Anti-Muslim violence, anti-Semitic violence, anti-immigrant violence, all fueled by the same toxic mix of fear, propaganda, and dehumanization. The rhetoric matters. The language we use matters. When politicians and media figures describe entire groups of people as invaders, as threats, as less than human, they are planting seeds. And some of those seeds will grow into violence. Wadea al-Fayoume was 6 years old. He liked dinosaurs. He loved his mother. He was learning to read. He had friends at school. He had a future. And all of that was stolen from him because a man decided that his identity made him an enemy. Think about that. A child murdered for being Palestinian. In America. In 2023, the trial revealed more details about Joseph's mental state. Defense attorneys attempted to argue diminished capacity, suggesting that he was not fully in control of his actions. But the evidence painted a different picture. This was not a psychotic break. This was not a moment of insanity. This was ideological violence, carefully considered and deliberately executed. Joseph had time to think. He had time to choose differently. He chose murder. The jury would eventually have to weigh these factors. But regardless of the legal outcome, the damage was done. A child was dead, a mother was traumatized, a community was scarred, and the message was sent to every Muslim, every Arab, every person who looks or prays differently. You are not safe, even in your own home, even with people you trust. The hatred can reach you anywhere. What does that do to a community? What does it do to a child who looks like Wadea, who shares his heritage, who now has to wonder if they are next? What does it do to parents who have to explain to their children that some people will hate them for reasons they cannot control, for identities they should be proud of? This is the true cost of extremist hatred. It is not just the immediate victims. It is the ripple effect. The fear, the suspicion, the erosion of trust. The sense that nowhere is truly safe. Hanaan has spoken publicly about her son, about the need for justice, about the need for change. Her strength is remarkable, but it should never have been tested in this way. She should be watching her son grow up, not visiting his grave. She should be helping him with homework, not testifying in court about his murder. The case of Wadea al-Fayoume forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about who we are as a society. How did we get here? How did we create an environment where a man could be radicalized by media consumption to the point of murdering a child? What responsibility do we bear, collectively, for the rhetoric that fuels this hatred? Some will argue that Joseph Chuba is solely responsible for his actions, and legally, that is true. But morally, the picture is more complex. He did not create the ideology that drove him to kill. He absorbed it. It was fed to him, day after day, by sources that profit from fear and division. And he is not the only one consuming that content. There are others out there right now being radicalized in the same way. Sitting in their homes, scrolling through their feeds, absorbing the same poison. And some of them will act on it. How do we stop that cycle? There are no easy answers. De-radicalization is difficult. Changing deeply held beliefs requires time, effort, and often professional intervention. But it starts with awareness. It starts with recognizing the signs. It starts with refusing to tolerate dehumanizing rhetoric, even when it is directed at groups we may not belong to. It starts with building relationships across lines of difference, so that people cannot easily be reduced to stereotypes and caricatures. It starts with remembering that Wadea al-Fayoume was a child, not a symbol, not a statistic, a child. The legal proceedings against Joseph Chuba continue as of this writing. He faces life in prison without the possibility of parole. But no sentence will bring Wadea back. No punishment will undo the trauma inflicted on Hanaan. No verdict will erase the fear that now lives in the hearts of Muslim and Arab Americans who see themselves in this story. The murder of Wadea al-Fayoume is a tragedy, but it is also a warning. It is a reminder that hatred, when left unchecked, when nurtured by ideology and fear, will always find a target, and that target can be anyone. A neighbor, a coworker, a child. Joseph Chuba lived next door to the al-Fayoume family for years. He knew them. He interacted with them. And yet, when the ideology demanded it, he was able to see them not as people, but as enemies. That is the power of extremist hatred. It overrides empathy, it overrides reason, it overrides our basic humanity. And it is spreading. In the aftermath of Wadea's murder, there were other incidents. Other attacks on Muslim Americans. Other acts of violence fueled by the same toxic ideology, each one a reminder that this is not an isolated problem. This is a pattern, and patterns, if left unaddressed, become norms. We have a choice to make. We can continue down this path, allowing fear and hatred to dictate our actions, allowing dehumanization to become acceptable, allowing violence to be the inevitable result, or we can choose differently. We can choose to see each other as human beings. We can choose to reject the rhetoric that divides us. We can choose to build a society where a child like Wadea can grow up safe, valued, and loved. But that choice requires action. It requires speaking out against hatred, even when it is uncomfortable. It requires challenging our own biases and assumptions. It requires building bridges instead of walls. It requires remembering that every victim of hate violence is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend. They are not abstractions. They are people. Wadea al-Fayoume was a person. He had a name. He had a face. He had a life that mattered. And he was taken from this world by a man who had been taught to hate him. Do you think Joseph Chuba wakes up at night and sees Wadea's face? Do you think he hears the screams? Do you think he feels remorse, or does the ideology still shield him from the full weight of what he has done? These are the questions that haunt this case. Because understanding the mind of someone capable of such an act is essential if we want to prevent it from happening again. And it will happen again unless we change course. Unless we confront the ideologies that make this violence possible. Unless we recognize that the monster next door is not born, but made. Joseph Chuba was made, by fear, by propaganda, by isolation, by a society that allowed hatred to flourish unchecked. And Wadea al-Fayoume paid the price. The boy who loved dinosaurs. The boy who smiled in his school photos. The boy who should be alive today, growing up, learning, playing, dreaming. Instead, he is a name on a headstone. A victim of a hate crime. A symbol of everything that is broken in our discourse, in our media, in our collective soul. His mother survived, but she will carry the scars forever. Physical scars from the knife wounds, emotional scars from the trauma. And the deepest scar of all, the absence of her son. The empty space where his laughter should be. The silence where his voice should echo. This is what extremist hatred does. It destroys. It takes. It leaves nothing but grief and questions in its wake. And somewhere right now, someone else is being radicalized. Someone else is consuming the same content that Joseph Chuba consumed. Someone else is learning to hate. Someone else is choosing a target. Will we stop them before it is too late? Or will there be another Wadea? Another family shattered? Another community mourning? The answer depends on what we do next. On whether we have the courage to confront the hatred in our midst. On whether we value human life more than ideology. On whether we can remember that behind every label, every stereotype, every caricature, there is a person. A child. A life that matters. Wadea al-Fayoume mattered. His life had value. His death was not inevitable. It was a choice. A choice made by one man, but enabled by a culture that taught him to hate. We can choose differently. We must choose differently. Because the alternative is unthinkable. The alternative is more children like Wadea. More families like the al-Fayoumes, more communities torn apart by violence that should never have happened. The monster next door is real. But he was not born a monster. He was made one. And if we do not address the forces that create monsters, we will continue to pay the price in blood and grief and shattered innocence. Wadea al-Fayoume was 6 years old when he died. He will never be 7. He will never grow up. He will never have the chance to become whoever he might have been. All of that potential, all of that possibility extinguished by hatred. Remember his name, remember his face. Remember that he was a child who deserved to live. And ask yourself, what are you willing to do to make sure this never happens again? Because the next victim could be anyone. The next killer could be anyone. The line between neighbor and murderer, between friend and enemy, is thinner than we want to believe. And it is crossed not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small choices. Choices to believe the propaganda. Choices to dehumanize. Choices to hate. Joseph Chuba made those choices, and a child died because of them. What choices will you make?